The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering against the bedroom windows like thousands of tiny fists demanding to be let inside. I remember the sound most clearly. Not his breathing, not my own heartbeat, but the rain, because I was staring at the ceiling, counting the droplets that streaked down the glass, trying to separate my mind from my body. The bedsheet beneath me was damp, but it wasn't from the rain. I had told him. 3 separate times that evening. I started my period today, the cramps are really bad. I even showed him the heating pad I'd plugged in beside the bed. I'd taken 2 ibuprofen at dinner. The evidence was everywhere if he'd cared to look. But looking was never his problem. His problem was seeing something he wanted and deciding, in that moment, that my body's boundaries were merely suggestions he could override with enough persistence. The clock on the nightstand read 11:47 p.m. I was staring at it when his hand slid across my stomach. I flinched, not dramatically, just a small, involuntary tightening of muscles that had learned to anticipate pain before it arrived. "Not tonight," I whispered. "I told you I'm on my period." He didn't withdraw his hand. Instead, his fingers pressed down slightly on my lower abdomen, right where the cramps were pulsing like a second heartbeat. "It's fine," he said. "It'll help with the pain." I wanted to laugh, or scream. The idea that he believed forcing himself inside me would somehow relieve the agony of my uterus contracting felt like the cruelest joke the universe had ever played on a woman's body. But I didn't laugh. I had learned by then that my laughter made him angry, and his anger made everything worse. I tried to shift away, rolling onto my side, curling my knees toward my chest like a wounded animal protecting its softest parts. He followed. His body pressed against my back, his arms snaking around my waist, pulling me back against him. "Sarah," he said, and his voice was gentle. That was the most confusing part. He always sounded gentle. "I need you. I can't sleep without it." The words hit my ears like a foreign language I once understood but had since forgotten. Need, without it, as if my body were a sleep aid, as if my pain were irrelevant compared to his restlessness. I didn't fight. I wish I could tell you I fought. I wish I could tell you I shoved him away, screamed, threw the lamp against the wall, called my mother, called the police, did anything other than what I actually did. But what I actually did was close my eyes and go somewhere else in my mind. Somewhere dry. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere the rain wasn't falling and my husband wasn't treating my body like a possession he'd purchased and could use regardless of its condition. I counted the cracks in the ceiling until I couldn't see them anymore because tears had filled my eyes and spilled over without permission. I didn't sob. I didn't shake. I just let the tears roll sideways across my temples and into my hair while he did what he wanted and then fell asleep within minutes, his arm still heavy across my ribs, trapping me in place. That was month 8 of our marriage. Month 8 of what I had started calling, only in the privacy of my locked journal, the hunger. But to understand how I ended up in that bed, on that night, with that man who was supposed to love me, I have to take you back to the beginning. Because the beginning was beautiful. And that's why it took me so long to recognize the ending. I met David when I was 26 years old, working as a graphic designer at a small marketing firm in Portland. He was the IT consultant they brought in when the company's server crashed and took 3 years of client files with it. I remember watching him work from my desk, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he chewed on the end of his pen without realizing it. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room and demanded attention. He was the kind of man who quietly solved problems while everyone else panicked. I found that deeply attractive. Our first conversation happened in the break room. I was reheating leftover pasta, and he was making instant coffee. He asked me about the project I was working on. Not in a generic, small-talk way, but with genuine curiosity about the design choices I'd made, the color palette, the typography. He listened when I answered. Actually listened, not just waited for his turn to speak. When I mentioned I was struggling with a particular client's demands, he offered to look at the file structure to see if there was a more efficient workflow. There was no flirtation, no agenda, just kindness. That became the pattern of our early relationship. Kindness without agenda. He brought me soup when I had a cold, left it outside my apartment door with a note that said "Feel better," and a poorly drawn, smiley face. He remembered my favorite author and surprised me with a signed copy of her newest novel for no reason at all. When my car broke down on the highway at midnight, he was the one who answered my panicked phone call, drove 40 minutes to get me, and didn't complain once about the inconvenience. My friends adored him. My mother adored him. Everyone who met David commented on how gentle he was, how thoughtful, how refreshingly uncomplicated. "You found a good one, Sarah," they all said. "Don't let him go." I had no intention of letting him go. I had never felt so safe with another human being in my entire life. The proposal happened on a hiking trail overlooking the Columbia River Gorge. It was October, and the trees were on fire with autumn color. He stumbled over his words, forgot half of what he'd planned to say, and eventually just got down on one knee in the mud and held out a ring that belonged to his grandmother. "I'm not good at speeches," he said, "but I'm good at loving you, and I want to do it for the rest of my life." I said yes before he finished the sentence. I would have said yes if he'd proposed in a parking lot. I was that certain. The wedding was small, 40 people in a renovated barn with string lights and wildflowers. I wore my mother's veil. He cried when I walked down the aisle. Actual tears, not just misty eyes. My father shook his hand and whispered something that made David laugh through the tears. The photographer captured a moment during the first dance where he was looking at me with such pure, unfiltered adoration that I had the photo framed and placed on my nightstand. I looked at it every morning when I woke up. And for a long time, it made me smile. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in a cabin on the Oregon coast. That's where the first small sign appeared. But I didn't recognize it as a sign. I recognized it as passion, as newlywed enthusiasm, as the natural hunger of a man who had waited for marriage and was now making up for lost time. I need to pause here and explain something about David. He was raised in a conservative religious household, not extreme but traditional. He had chosen, before we met, to wait until marriage. I respected that decision even though my own background was different. I had been in 2 serious relationships before him, and intimacy was a normal part of both. I wasn't ashamed of that, and neither was he. "The past doesn't matter," he told me once, early in our dating. "Only what we build together matters." I believed him. I still believe he meant it. But what I didn't understand then, what I understand now with painful clarity, is that waiting doesn't eliminate hunger. It just delays it. And sometimes, when hunger is delayed long enough, it transforms into something else entirely. Something that doesn't recognize boundaries because it never learned how. The first night in the cabin, we were both nervous. There was laughter, fumbling, the kind of awkwardness that comes with learning another person's body for the first time. It wasn't perfect, but it was sweet. And when we fell asleep tangled together under a heavy quilt with the sound of waves crashing in the distance, I felt a contentment I had never experienced before. This was my husband. This was my person. This was the beginning of forever. The second night, he wanted to try again, and the third, and the fourth. By the end of the first week, we had been intimate every single night, sometimes twice. I was tired but happy. This was what newlyweds did, wasn't it? This was the honeymoon phase everyone talked about. My married friends had warned me it would be intense at first and then settle into a comfortable rhythm. I assumed we were just in the intense beginning. I assumed the settling would come naturally. But it didn't come, not the second week of the honeymoon, not the first month back in our new apartment, not the third month or the fifth. The frequency didn't decrease. If anything, it increased. And more than the frequency, it was the urgency that began to shift. The way he reached for me went from tender to expectant. The way he looked at me when I changed clothes went from appreciative to something hungrier. Something that made me instinctively turn my back or pull the curtain closed. I told myself I was being silly. Of course my husband wanted me. That was a good thing. That was what every woman wanted, wasn't it? A husband who desired her, who couldn't keep his hands off her, who made her feel attractive and wanted and alive. But desire and demand are not the same thing. They just wear very similar clothing. The first time I said no was 3 months into the marriage. I had a sinus infection that made my head feel like it was filled with cement. I could barely breathe through my nose. I was running a low-grade fever. I had taken cold medicine that made me groggy and disoriented. When he reached for me that night, I gently pushed his hand away. "Not tonight, babe," I said. "I feel terrible." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, just okay." And he rolled over. I felt a wave of relief. He understood. He respected my no. He was still the gentle man I married. But then, around 3 a.m., I woke up to his hand on my hip. At first I thought I was dreaming, but his fingers were moving, insistent, deliberate. "David," I mumbled, my throat sore and scratchy. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer with words. He just kept touching me, his body pressing closer in the darkness. "I'm sick," I said, louder this time. "I told you I don't feel well." He sighed, a long, frustrated sigh that made my stomach clench. "You're always sick," he muttered. And then he turned away again, but this time the silence was heavy. This time the silence felt like punishment. I lay awake for the rest of the night, my congested head throbbing, trying to understand what had just happened. He had stopped. Technically, he had stopped. But he had also made it clear that my illness was an inconvenience to him, that my body's limitations were a personal disappointment, that my no, while technically accepted, was not actually respected. It was tolerated, grudgingly, and that tolerance came with an emotional cost I was already learning to pay. The next morning he made me breakfast. Pancakes, my favorite. He brought them to me in bed with a cup of tea and an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry about last night," he said. "I was half asleep. I didn't mean to push." I accepted the apology. I accepted the pancakes. I accepted the narrative that it was a one-time mistake, a moment of sleepy confusion, not a reflection of something deeper. Because accepting that narrative was easier than confronting the alternative. And I was still, at that point, deeply in love with the man I thought I married. I need to make something clear before I continue. David wasn't a monster. He wasn't some caricature of masculine entitlement who sneered at my pain and demanded I submit. He was kind, most of the time. He was thoughtful in 100 small ways. He remembered to buy my favorite coffee creamer. He sent me texts during the day just to say he was thinking about me. He planned surprise date nights and held my hand in public and told me I was beautiful even when I was wearing sweatpants and hadn't showered. These things were real. They weren't an act, and that's what made the other moments so confusing. How could the same man who left me love notes on the bathroom mirror also look at me with cold disappointment when I declined intimacy? How could the same hands that so gently brushed hair from my face also grip my waist with an insistence that bordered on demand? I didn't have words for what was happening. I didn't have a framework. Nobody warns you about the gray areas. Nobody tells you that a man can love you and still treat your body like it belongs to him. Nobody explains that coercion doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like a sad sigh. Sometimes it looks like a cold shoulder. Sometimes it looks like pancakes in bed the next morning and a promise that it won't happen again until it does. The pattern established itself slowly, the way erosion reshapes a coastline. You don't notice the change day to day. You only notice when you look back and realize the landscape has completely transformed. By month 6 of our marriage, I had learned to track his moods the way meteorologists track incoming storms. I knew which days were safe and which days required careful navigation. I knew that if he had a stressful day at work, he would need intimacy to unwind, and my feelings on the matter were secondary. I knew that if I said no 2 nights in a row, the third night would come with an emotional withdrawal so palpable I could feel it in the air between us. I knew that the easiest path to peace was to say yes, even when my body was screaming no. But my body was starting to scream more frequently. The chronic pain had begun around month 4, though I didn't have a name for it yet. At first it was just heavy periods, cramping that lasted a few days longer than normal, fatigue I couldn't shake. I assumed it was stress. Marriage was wonderful, but it was also an adjustment. Learning to share space, finances, decisions, a future. My doctor suggested it might be endometriosis, but the diagnosis wasn't confirmed. "Track your symptoms," she said. "Come back in 6 months, we'll see if there's a pattern." There was a pattern. The pain was getting worse, and David's response to my pain was getting worse too. The first time he didn't stop during my period was month 7. I had told him earlier that day. "Just a heads up, I started." He nodded, said he understood, brought me a heating pad without being asked. I thought with relief that he was learning, that he was adapting, that the early tension of our marriage was smoothing out into the rhythm everyone promised. That night he initiated anyway. When I reminded him, gently, of what I'd told him earlier, he shrugged. "I don't mind," he said. "It doesn't bother me," I stared at him. "It bothers me," I said. "I'm in pain, I'm bleeding, I don't want to." Another shrug, another sigh. "You know it actually helps with cramps," he said. "There's science behind it." I didn't know if there was science behind it. I still don't know. And honestly, it doesn't matter. Because even if there's a study somewhere that suggests orgasms can relieve menstrual cramps, that study wasn't written about women who were being pressured into intimacy by husbands who couldn't take no for an answer. I held my ground that night. It was one of the few times I did. He rolled away from me with enough force to shake the mattress. The next morning, he didn't speak to me. Not a single word. He made coffee only for himself. He left for work without kissing me goodbye. I sat at the kitchen table in my bathrobe, staring at the half-empty coffee pot, and felt a loneliness so profound it made my bones ache. Or maybe that was just the cramps. It was getting harder to tell the difference. When he came home that evening, he brought flowers. Pink roses, which were my favorite. He apologized. He said he didn't know what was wrong with him lately. He said work was stressing him out. He said he would do better. He said all the right things in all the right order. And I believed him again, because believing him was easier than admitting I had married a man who valued his physical release above my physical comfort. Believing him meant I didn't have to make any difficult decisions. Believing him meant I could keep living in the beautiful story we had built together. The story everyone else could see from the outside. The story I had told myself so many times I couldn't distinguish it from the truth. But month 8 was the night of the rain. And after that night, something inside me cracked. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It was a hairline fracture that spread slowly, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. I began to notice things I had been deliberately ignoring. The way he positioned himself between me and the bedroom door during arguments. The way he monitored my phone, not overtly, but with casual glances that he probably thought I didn't see. The way he commented on my outfits, suggesting I wear this instead of that, his preferences slowly becoming my wardrobe. The way my world had shrunk without me noticing, my social circle reduced to people he approved of, my evenings spent at home because going out meant coming home late, and coming home late meant he would already be in a mood. I started writing in my journal again, something I hadn't done since before the wedding. The entries were fragmented, disjointed, the handwriting shaky. He says he loves me. He does love me, but why does his love hurt? Why does his love feel like a transaction where my body is the currency? I'm so tired. My body is tired. My heart is tired. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I didn't show anyone these entries. I barely admitted them to myself. Because what would I say? My husband wants to be intimate too often. People would laugh. People would tell me I was lucky. People would say there were women who would kill for a husband who desired them that much. The narrative was always that male desire was a compliment, never a burden. And I had internalized that narrative so deeply I couldn't see it for the lie it was. The pain in my body continued to worsen. By month 10, I was having episodes that left me doubled over, unable to stand straight. The bleeding became heavier, more erratic, sometimes lasting 2 weeks out of every month. My doctor scheduled tests, mentioned words like laparoscopy and possible uterine fibroids, and told me to rest as much as possible. Rest. As if I could rest when my husband's needs loomed over me every night like a scheduled appointment I wasn't allowed to cancel. I tried to explain it to him once. Really explain. Not just not tonight, but the full truth of what was happening inside my body. "David," I said, sitting across from him at the dinner table, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea I was too nauseated to drink. "My body is fighting itself. Every month, the lining of my uterus grows where it shouldn't. It attaches to other organs. It creates scar tissue. Every period is like my insides are being scraped with sandpaper. And when we're intimate, especially during those times, it feels like..." I paused, searching for words he could understand. "It feels like being torn open from the inside." He looked at me for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. Then he said, "So what do you want me to do? Just never touch you again?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized with a hollow ache that he hadn't heard a single word I said. He had only heard a threat to his access. My pain was an inconvenience. My diagnosis was a negotiation. My body was a resource he felt entitled to, and my illness was interfering with his supply. That was the night I first thought about leaving. The thought arrived fully formed, without warning, like a stranger walking through an unlocked door. You could leave. You could pack a bag. You could drive to your sister's house in Seattle. You could start over. I pushed the thought away as quickly as it came. Divorce wasn't an option. Divorce meant failure. Divorce meant admitting I had made the worst mistake of my life in front of everyone who had celebrated my wedding. Divorce meant breaking my mother's heart. Divorce meant starting over at 27 with a chronic illness and a broken spirit. Who would want me then, so I stayed. And I learned to dissociate more effectively. I learned to count ceiling tiles. I learned to focus on a single spot on the wall until the rest of the room blurred. I learned to breathe through the pain in a way that didn't look like pain, because any visible sign of discomfort would either be ignored or, worse, would trigger his frustration. "You're not even present," he accused once, pulling away from me with a look of disgust. "It's like being with a corpse." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. He had created a situation where the only way I could survive his touch was to leave my body entirely, and then he was angry that I wasn't present enough. I couldn't win. There was no version of this where I could win. Month 11 brought a new development. He stopped asking entirely, not in a dramatic, declarative way, just a gradual erosion of the pretense that my consent mattered. He would initiate without words, without checking in, without any acknowledgement that I might have feelings about what was happening. The first time it happened, I was half asleep, jolted into awareness by his hands on my body. "David," I whispered. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer, he just kept going, and I froze. Because somewhere in the primitive part of my brain, a switch flipped. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was an act of taking. And my body knew, even if my conscious mind wasn't ready to admit it, that what was happening had crossed a line. The next morning, I stood in the shower until the water ran cold. I scrubbed my skin until it was raw. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything at all. I was floating somewhere above my body, watching a woman I didn't recognize go through the motions of her life. She made coffee. She answered emails. She smiled at her husband when he kissed her goodbye. She was very convincing, this woman. No one would have guessed she was screaming. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in December. It had been 13 months since our wedding. The diagnosis had finally come through. Stage 3 endometriosis with extensive adhesions. My doctor, a kind woman with gray-streaked hair and gentle hands, had shown me the ultrasound images. "The tissue has attached to your bowel and your bladder," she explained, pointing to the cloudy masses on the screen. "This is why you're experiencing so much pain during intercourse. Your uterus is essentially tethered to other organs. Every movement pulls on tissue that shouldn't be connected." She recommended surgery. She recommended pelvic floor therapy. She recommended, in the gentlest possible terms, that I avoid intimacy until the adhesions could be addressed. "Continuing will only cause more inflammation and more scar tissue," she said. "It could make the condition worse in the long term." I drove home with the ultrasound images on the passenger seat and a strange sense of relief settling over me. Finally, I had proof. Finally, I had a medical reason that even David couldn't argue with. Finally, I could say no without it being a personal rejection. Finally, I could rest. I was naive. Even after everything, I was still naive. I showed him the images that evening. I explained the diagnosis. I used the doctor's words, the medical terminology, the recommended treatment plan. I handed him the pamphlet on endometriosis that included a section on painful intercourse. I gave him every piece of evidence I had, hoping it would make him understand what my words never could. He listened, he looked at the images, he read the pamphlet, and then he set it down on the coffee table and said, "So basically you're telling me our sex life is over. Not 'I'm so sorry you're in pain,' not 'how can I support you through this,' not 'let's figure out a plan together.' Just a flat statement about what my medical condition meant for him." I stared at him. "Did you hear anything I just said?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. "I'm in pain, David. My organs are stuck together. I need surgery, the doctor said. He cut me off. I know what the doctor said, but doctors aren't married to you. They don't understand what it's like to be rejected every night by your own wife. He stood up from the couch, pacing now, his voice rising. Do you have any idea what this does to me? Do you care at all? Something inside me, the part that had been cracking for months, finally shattered, not into anger, into clarity, cold, sharp, devastating clarity. I was married to a man who saw my body as a service provider. When the service was interrupted, he didn't see a suffering partner, he saw a broken appliance. My pain was an inconvenience. My diagnosis was a betrayal. My needs didn't exist as a separate category from his wants. I had been trying to explain myself to someone who wasn't interested in understanding. Because understanding would require him to see me as a full human being, not as a body that belonged to him. I'm going to stay at my sister's, I heard myself say. The words came out before I consciously decided to speak them. I need some space to think. He stopped pacing, turned to look at me. His expression shifted from anger to something else, something that looked almost like fear. Sarah, come on, don't be dramatic, I'm just frustrated. You know I love you, I need you, you know how I get when I'm stressed. You know how I get. As if his behavior were a weather pattern, an immutable force of nature that I was responsible for accommodating. As if my job was to manage his emotions by sacrificing my body on demand. As if love meant never having to respect a boundary. I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I just picked up my phone and walked into the bedroom. I could hear him following me, his voice shifting from defensive to pleading to angry and back again, cycling through tactics like someone flipping through a playbook. When the door closed between us, I locked it. I had never locked a door in my own home before. The click of the bolt was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The next hour was a blur. I packed a bag, not everything, just enough for a week. Underwear. Sweaters, my journal. The framed wedding photo on my nightstand I left behind. I couldn't look at it without feeling sick. He was waiting in the living room when I came out. He tried to block the door. Please, he said, and there were actual tears in his eyes. Please don't do this. I'll change. I'll go to therapy. I'll do whatever you want. The tears almost worked. They almost pulled me back into the gravitational field of his need. But I looked at his face, at the tears streaming down his cheeks, and I realized something that made my stomach turn cold. He wasn't crying because he had hurt me. He was crying because he was losing access to me. The tears were real, but they weren't for me. They were for him. Move, I said, and after a long moment he did. The drive to Seattle took 3 hours. The rain followed me the entire way, streaking across the windshield in patterns that blurred the road ahead. I didn't turn on music. I didn't listen to podcasts. I just drove in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, my mind replaying 13 months of marriage in fragmented loops. The pancake apologies. The cold shoulders. The way he held my hand in public and took my body in private. The way love and violation had become so entangled, I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. My sister met me at the door. She took one look at my face and pulled me inside without asking questions. She made tea, she wrapped me in a blanket. She sat with me on her couch while I stared at the wall and tried to find words for things I didn't want to name. Sarah, she finally said, her voice soft but firm. You don't have to tell me everything tonight, but I need to know one thing. Are you safe? Such a simple question, such a complicated answer. Was I safe? He had never hit me. He had never screamed threats. He had never done anything that would qualify in a legal sense as assault. But safety isn't just about physical violence. Safety is about knowing your boundaries will be respected. Safety is about believing that your no carries weight. Safety is about being able to fall asleep next to someone without bracing for what might happen in the dark. I wasn't safe. I hadn't been safe for a long time, and I hadn't let myself know it until that moment on my sister's couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like lavender, staring at a mug of tea I was too exhausted to drink. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life, harder than the diagnosis, harder than the years of pain that followed, because leaving wasn't a single decision made once. Leaving was a decision I had to make every single day, sometimes every single hour, against the relentless pull of everything I thought I believed. He called constantly. He sent texts ranging from desperate apologies to bitter accusations. He showed up at my sister's apartment once, and I hid in the bathroom while she told him through the door that he needed to leave. He emailed me a 12-page letter detailing all the ways he would change, all the therapy he would attend, all the promises he would keep. I read it 3 times, searching for the part where he acknowledged what he had done. It wasn't there. The letter was about his feelings, his needs, his pain, his desire to be better. It never once named the reality of what had happened in our bedroom. Because to name it would be to admit something he couldn't admit, even to himself. I found a therapist who specialized in trauma. The first session, I couldn't speak. I just sat in her office, staring at a box of tissues on the side table, while 45 minutes ticked by in absolute silence. She didn't push. She just sat with me, patient and present, and at the end of the session she said, "You don't have to have the words yet, just coming here is enough." I cried the entire drive home. Not sad tears, relief tears. The kind of tears that come when someone finally tells you that your pain counts, that your story matters, that you're not crazy or dramatic or broken. The kind of tears that start the healing even though the healing feels impossible. It took 6 months of therapy before I could say the word. Marital rape. The first time I said it out loud, I expected the world to end. I expected the ceiling to collapse, the walls to crumble, the ground to open up and swallow me. None of that happened. My therapist just nodded, her expression steady and compassionate, and said, "That's a very hard truth to speak, I'm proud of you." I had been so afraid of the word that I hadn't let myself think it, let alone say it. But naming something gives you power over it. Naming it was the beginning of taking my life back. The divorce was finalized 14 months after I walked out the door. It wasn't a clean process. He contested everything, not because he wanted to stay married, but because he wanted to maintain control. Every court date, every mediation session, every signed document was another battle in a war he refused to end. But I had good legal representation and a therapist who helped me stand my ground when I wanted to give in just to make it stop. When the final papers were signed, I didn't feel celebration. I felt exhaustion. And underneath the exhaustion, something quiet and steady. Freedom, not the dramatic kind you see in movies, the real kind. The kind that feels like being able to breathe all the way down to the bottom of your lungs for the first time in years. The surgery happened 3 months after the divorce. The recovery was long and painful, but it was a clean kind of pain, the kind that meant healing rather than damage. I spent 6 weeks in my sister's guest room, watching bad television and learning to listen to my body again. My body, which I had treated as an enemy for so long, slowly became a companion. I learned its signals. I respected its limits. I stopped blaming it for the pain and started thanking it for surviving. It's been 3 years now since that rainy night. 3 years since I lay in bed counting ceiling tiles while my husband took what he wanted and called it love. I still think about it sometimes. Not with the same raw, jagged pain. More like pressing on a bruise that's mostly healed, just to remind myself it was real. Because that's the thing about this kind of trauma. The world doesn't give you permission to call it trauma. There are no visible scars, no police reports, no headlines, just a quiet erosion of self that happens in the dark, in the space where love and violation blur together until you can't tell the difference anymore. I'm sharing this story now because I know I'm not the only one. I know there are women reading this who have felt the same confusion, the same guilt, the same desperate hope that if they just explain themselves well enough, their partner will finally understand. I'm here to tell you that understanding was never the problem. Respect was the problem, and no amount of explanation can create respect where it doesn't exist. Marriage does not grant unlimited access to another person's body. Love does not erase boundaries. Commitment does not mean saying yes every time. Your body belongs to you, always and completely, and anyone who tells you differently, whether with words or with sighs or with cold shoulders or with tears, is not loving you. They are using you. And there is a difference, even when it's hard to see. Especially when it's hard to see. I'm healing now, slowly, imperfectly. I've dated a little, though trust is something I'm still learning to rebuild. I've found a community of women with similar stories, and their strength has carried me through days when my own strength wasn't enough. I've learned to speak about what happened without shame, because the shame was never mine to carry. It belonged to the man who decided his needs were more important than my pain. And I've given it back to him, symbolically at least, piece by piece, until the weight I carried for so long became light enough to set down. Last week, I walked on the beach near my new apartment. It was a clear day, no rain, the sky stretching blue and endless above the water. I took off my shoes and let the cold waves rush over my feet. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, just being, just existing in a body that was finally mine again. Completely mine. And for the first time in years, I felt something that surprised me. Not anger, not grief, not even relief. I felt hope. Quiet and tentative and fragile but real. The kind of hope that comes when you finally accept that the past doesn't define the future, that pain doesn't last forever, that even the hardest stories can have a next chapter. The tide was coming in, erasing footprints behind me, making the sands smooth and new. I watched the water erase my path and thought about all the versions of myself I've been. The naive bride, the confused wife, the woman counting ceiling tiles in the dark, the survivor learning to breathe again. And now this version, the one standing barefoot at the edge of an ocean, feeling the cold salt water on her skin and knowing, truly knowing that she belongs to herself. Not to anyone else. Not anymore, not ever again. The sun was setting behind me, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I didn't rush to leave. I stayed until the last light faded, until the stars began to appear one by one, until the cold became just sharp enough to remind me I was alive. Then I picked up my shoes and walked back across the sand toward the lights of my apartment, my footprints the only ones on the beach, a path written in temporary ink on the edge of an endless sea.